thank you to everyone joining us today. My name is David Dayen. I am the executive editor of the American Prospect, author of the my newest book, Monopolize Life in the Age of Corporate Power, which, if you have a good eye, is right behind me. This panel is about the post-pandemic, post-Trump economy. And I think a good way to frame it is to look at the current pandemic Trump economy. One of the most disturbing government reports that I think I've ever read was released just yesterday by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It was a survey taken in late June, and it found that about 41% of respondents reported at least one adverse mental or behavioral health condition as a result of the current situation, either trauma, anxiety, depression, or increased substance use to cope with stress. 10.7% of respondents contemplated suicide over the past 30 days. And for those aged 18 to 24, that number was over 25%. So 1 in 4 of our young people thought about killing themselves in the month of the period provided. And I can tell you from my own writing and my own correspondence with people struggling during this crisis that this comes as absolutely no surprise. The loneliness and isolation associated with social distancing and the alienating effects of social media certainly play a role, but so does the increasing desperation associated with this current economy. Since the beginning of the month, 29 million people now receiving unemployment benefits are not getting any additional support from the federal government. The elimination of this critical benefit will have extremely damaging effects that the White House's insufficient and far too temporary executive action is not going to fix. The prospects now are for a double dip recession, for max evictions and foreclosures that are not stopped by a moratorium, and for an economy potentially handed over to a new president that looks like smoking rubble. At the same time, the major stock indexes are all near record highs, a function of the $4.5 trillion money cannon that was aimed at corporate America in the CARES Act while giving temporary relief to individuals and small businesses that has now run out. It's hard to fathom, but the richer segments of our society are proceeding as if COVID-19 never happened, while the lower classes struggle and suffer. The two Americas that we've heard talked about for decades on the left have never been more sharply divided than in this moment. This panel intends to discuss how we pick up the pieces. And the good news is that we can do that. Over the past decade or more, progressives have filled a shelf with ideas for how to make our economy work again for all its citizens while protecting the planet and improving our health. We can restore what Joe Biden often calls the basic bargain with Americans, and we can end the second Gilded Age once and for all. And I'm really pleased. I don't think we could have a better group of people to talk about how to do that than the people we have assembled. So I want to get right into the discussion. I will say if you have questions for this panel, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and we will get to them as we go along through this panel. So I want to start with Congressman Khanna from California's 17th Congressional District, and I should mention that his appearance on this panel makes me only the second most famous panel member who graduated from Council Rock High School in Newtown, Pennsylvania. So thank you for that, Ro. And I'll also mention that Congressman Khanna has to leave a little bit early for this panel, so we're going to start with him. So Congressman, talk to me about how the pandemic in particular has exposed these fault lines within US society, whether you're talking about healthcare, poverty, US preparedness, small business support, whatever. How has the pandemic really shown the depths to which we need to reform this economy?
Well, David, thank you for convening this panel. Thank you for your writing, which I find very insightful on our times and on economic issues. Let me start with an anecdote. It may sound harsh, but I think it gives a window into the divide. I was talking to someone in my district who said, not aware of her own tone deafness, oh wow, thank you, COVID. My husband's business is doing really well. It was a tech platform, and we're all getting to spend time as a family. And my husband's not traveling as much. And the person didn't mean it in an insulting way, but then sort of stepped back and said, no, I don't mean. I know people are suffering in the debts, and I have great empathy for that. But it was a window into how different our experiences are on COVID. People who are in the tech sector, some of them are booming. And through, they Zoom, for example, in my district, very brilliant entrepreneur who persevered, came here after 8 attempts. Their business model is doing really well. The tech companies are driving in many ways the stock market as more people realize that they have to participate in the digital economy. And they're able to shelter, they're able to work from home, they're not exposing themselves as much to the virus. On the other hand, there are many, many Americans who don't have that luxury, who have to go out to work, who are actually, in many ways, what we call the essential workers, because they're the ones giving our packages, they're the ones who are making sure we get groceries, and they aren't being paid a fair wage. They don't have the money to have childcare. Many of them, if they've lost jobs, don't have health care. So there is this extraordinary divide of wealth growing on the one hand, and everyone else who has been working, who has been left out, facing evictions, facing the horrible work conditions. I don't know of other panelists on this call. I order Amazon packages as well as our family, and I don't think we pay sufficient attention to the condition of some of those Amazon workers who are in some cases packed like sardines in these warehouses. So many of us knew this inequality, and I think what COVID has done is just brought it to the surface and exposed it, where now almost every American recognizes that stark inequality.
Great, thank you. I want to move just to put a ribbon on where we find ourselves right now, and I want to bring in Holly Mitchell, who represents the 30th Senate District in California State Legislature. Has chaired the Senate Budget Committee. Currently a candidate for the most powerful legislative body that nobody knows about, the LA County Board of Supervisors, a 5-member panel that represents 10 million people. Each district is bigger than several states. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about the situation facing state, county, and local governments right now, because this is going to be one of the most critical challenges to restoring the economy, because all of the austerity that we might see at that level is going to counteract whatever we might be able to do at the federal level. So could you take us into what is going on with that?
Happy to. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be on this panel with people. Joe, I know we hang out talking about poverty, but it's my first time meeting the congressman and follow Rhiana. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm honored. If I may, if I can start, just particularly in response to the congressman's comment, yesterday was equal pay day for Black women. Black women still earn 62 cents to the white male dollar. And so that one statistic alone reminds us that being Black and female in this country in and of itself is a pre-existing condition. And so when you add a global public health and economic pandemic on top of that, no wonder 41% of those polled talked about a behavioral and health adverse effect. In my case, I would add to that overeating. which is a problem for me and for Black women disproportionately, unfortunately. And so in response to the Congressman, yes, I represent an incredibly diverse district from Century City, Cheviot Hills, one of the highest income earning zip codes in the country, to my own native community of South LA. So it's incredibly socioeconomically diverse and ethnically diverse. And so I've heard from constituents and have used them and their life experience in my own lens in figuring out how we develop policy to help navigate the state, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, through this and out of this. When the governor released his May revision, using that term loosely, because the reality was it was a brand new budget compared to what we'd seen in January. It projected a $54 billion deficit over the next several years, larger than our darkest moment in our Great Recession, which was about a $40 billion deficit. And so we had tough decisions to make. And as you said, many of us were in the legislature during the Great Recession, and we know the harm our austerity actions did to people. And I was clear, and I'm proud to be a member of a progressive Senate leadership that was clear that we didn't want to do that to California residents. When the economy tanks and government has to contract, that's when our residents need government the most. That's not the time when we should pull back on our Medi-Cal spending or our CalFresh spending or our CalWorks reimbursement rate. It's the worst time. And so fortunately, under my leadership, I'll have to say, over the last couple of years, when the going was good here in California, we created pretty solid rainy day funds, one of which was for our entitlement programs, because we knew the pendulum would swing back. And so to stave off those actions, we were able to tap into some of these reserve accounts. We only spent down half to really kind of break the fall, if you will, in this first budget year. We're currently engaged in very active conversations in the legislature, our last 3 weeks in session for this year, about ways in which we can generate revenue. And we're talking about some of the typical ideas, how we tax the top 1% income earners, the 30,000 Californians who are, uber wealthy, in my humble opinion. And so we're looking at a variety of creative ways to figure out how we can raise revenue. But what was most important to me as budget chair and many of my colleagues was that we wouldn't take actions that we took during the past recession, where we cut deeply into the core of critical health sustaining programs. We also had to take a step up and provide state level support to many, to my undocumented brothers and sisters, areas, quite frankly, where the federal government could not and would not. And so we stepped in to close that gap too. That's what we were able to accomplish this year. We won't have those reserve funds and kind of the same kind of budget toolbox that I was able to tap into this year in out years. And so that's where we're having the conversation about how can we, in these times, increase revenue. The federal government supporting local government, state and local government, is going to be critical. One element of our $135 billion budget that we did pass was an expectation that the feds would come in and support us to the tune of about $14 billion. If not, we will activate triggers and cuts to our court system, higher ed, and others. The governor's May budget suggested broader cuts to the health and human services areas and education K through 12. We shifted that and focused on those areas. We are funding K through 14 education at last year's funding level. We are attempting to augment many of those districts that are feeding families, outside of what they were able to get in terms of their reimbursement when schools were closed. So we're doing all that we can. We are stretching and bending and doing all that we can to really keep California whole as we survive this.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing up that the support for undocumented immigrants was a really innovative policy that California has instituted and maybe has lessons for what we might need to do on the federal level. I want to bring in Joe Sanberg at this point. Joe is the founder of Working Hero Action and an anti-poverty champion and leading advocate for poor folks. Joe, the pandemic has obviously impacted and widened inequality, as we've been talking about here. And, what are the holes in the safety net that you think really need to be filled right now that have been exposed by the crisis? And what policies are you looking to reverse that damage?
Well, I think you said it exactly right. The pandemic has exposed just how broken the rules of the road are for the economy. And the pandemic has exaggerated the effects of that. I think the biggest focus area of mine lately has been educating people about what is truly extreme in the minimum wage debate. And that's that it's only $7.25. And putting in historic context why we really should be fighting for a $25 minimum wage. And here's why. If you had grown the minimum wage from 1960 at the rate of productivity, it would be $22.50 today. And yet it's only $7.25. Now let's unpack who minimum wage workers are so we'd understand where that $15.25 per hour gap has been taken from. Because it's really just slow, subtle, but pernicious wage theft over a period of 60 years. And it's primarily come out of the pockets of women. 2 out of 3 minimum wage workers in the United States are women. And so when we talk about the urgency of making the minimum wage a living wage, we're also talking about a rule change that would close the gender wage gap to a significant extent. I think there's an irony actually here too, which is when you look at the $600 supplemental unemployment insurance per week that's been delivered, right? And you annualize that, it would be equal to the minimum wage annualized for a 40-hour-a-week work week if the minimum wage had grown with productivity and it were $22.50 today. And so I think in closing, I'm focused on the $25 minimum wage because this has to be a moment where we rededicate ourselves to actually solving things. I was talking with someone earlier and I was citing what we all love to hear from Yoda, which is you either do or do not, there is no try. And I think one of the animating threads that unites all of us in this panel and all the attendees of this conference as progressives is that more than any ideology, I think what we stand for is you actually have to fix problems. You have to deliver solutions. Proposing solely steps is the realm of people who have the privilege of being able to wait on things to get better. But as the pandemic is exposed, we have an economy where 8 out of 10 people are living paycheck to paycheck. And those people don't have the luxury of waiting on decades more of steps. They need solutions right now.
Great. Thank you. I will get Rhiana and Zephyr in a second, but since Congressman Khanna has to go early, I want to front load a couple things. And this is an important point. So we're about to get onto this moment where the folks in the Republican Party who have spent massive amounts of money on tax cuts and things like that are going to get deficit religion as soon as a Democratic Congress, Democratic president comes on the scene and decide that we no longer can afford to do any of these things that we've been talking about and more. Congressman, how do we escape the deficit trap, this idea that the federal government is broke after the significant fiscal measures that we've already taken? And to what extent can the Trump tax cuts be used? If we need pay-fors right now, there's over $2 trillion that was mostly given to the rich and powerful in that tax legislation. Can that be a strong counteract to that? But more so, is there a way to break out of this trap and say that we need to support our people with the needs that they have?
It's a great question. The first thing that we ought to do is start with certain facts. I mean, inflation is at a all-time low. You don't have a lot of velocity of money because people just aren't buying things or engaging in as many transactions given the pandemic. Interest rates are at an all-time low. So why do deficits matter? Deficits matter over the long run because they put pressure at some point for either interest rates to go up or inflation to go up. But given that that's not the case, it makes far more sense to be able to borrow money at a low interest rate and help people so that they can make their rent payments, so that they can, their small businesses don't go under, so that they can buy essential items. And that will actually cause economic growth and prevent the deficit from going even deeper. Because if we didn't do that, we'd have more unemployment, we'd have less consumer spending, and you'd actually have less revenue and longer structural deficits. That's not my point. That is Jerome Powell, who's basically begging Congress to say, let's spend. We have a demand side problem in this country. We don't have a sufficient consumer spending. So I think we have to continue to make that basic economic case. Too often the Democrats haven't been making that case. We've bought into this erroneous deficit frame. And then the second thing is, I think on a very simple basis, we just need to say, if the Fed and the government have enough money to buy junk bonds, if they have enough money to bail out corporations, how do they not have enough money to help middle class and working families? Why is it always that the money is there to help bail out corporations or buy junk bonds, but not there for community banks, for minority development institutes, for ordinary families? Why is that the policy? And I think that resonates with people when you put it that way. Final point, $2 trillion, which is what we're asking for in Congress, is 10% of our entire GDP. We can afford as a nation 10% of GDP spending in the greatest healthcare crisis this country has had in over 100 years.
Yeah, that's great. And the question of Fed support is just sort of a whole other matter. They have this program for municipal liquidity support that they've used one time. There's been billions of dollars given to corporate bonds to purchase 800 different companies' corporate bonds, but they've used one time the municipal lending facility, and they could certainly, under different authorities, do short-term loans to states and cities with huge time horizons when they roll them over. And that would be the ability to have these states and cities not face the terrible challenges that Holly was talking about. So I want to bring in Rhiana Gunn-Wright, who is the Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute, a key architect of the Green New Deal. Right now, what we've been talking about is focusing on this sort of near-term economic crisis. But part of that is a crisis of a lack of preparedness, of the fact that our policies that were in place had little chance to respond to a crisis that we all knew about, which is the potential for a pandemic. It seems like there's a parallel there with the climate crisis, which we know is coming down the pike. What policies in the support of a stronger economy can also provide solutions to the climate crisis?
Sure, thanks. And also, my name's Rhiana Gunn-Wright.
I'm sorry, did I say right, Gunn? I'm very sorry.
Yeah, it's totally fine. That's more NRA friendly, or actually both of them are. It's really unfortunate. So honestly, there's actually a lot of overlap between what we can do, what we need to do with the climate crisis, and what we need to do to build a stronger economy. And that's because in lots of ways, the solutions to both sort of dovetail. One of the issues that we have with the climate crisis is there's a ton of work to be done, right? There's a lot of things that need to be overhauled. There are a lot of things that need to be built. And as we're seeing right now, with even medical supplies, one of the issues that the US has is essentially we don't have any of our supply chains. They are all largely abroad. And we have needed for a long time also to rebuild a real economy, in the sense of an economy that builds things and is not sort of purely the result of financialization, the way that we have now. And I think that's clear by what you were talking about, where the stock market is up and the rest of the economy is not up. right? And there's such a split between those two. And so some of the things that we're talking about is in some ways state and municipal support. Because the thing about climate is because there's so much work to be done, there's often policies in each of the things that we talk about needing to deliver money and through a stimulus, right? Money to individuals, money to families, money to businesses, money to state and locals. And at each of those levels, you have things, climate policies that you could use. So say individuals, families, you have utility assistance programs, weatherization assistance programs, right? If you fund the federal utility assistance program, you're talking about putting money directly into people's pockets. If you fund weatherization programs, that also means that once it's possible, you're giving opportunities for more jobs, but also people are coming in and doing energy efficiency upgrades, which reduces carbon emissions and of course puts more money back into people's pockets. And if you're talking about sort of differential impacts, it's really impactful utility assistance for low-income families because they pay far more of their paychecks in utilities. And, you know, utility shutoffs are far more likely, even at the same payment levels for Black and brown folks, right? So you're actually, this one policy is hitting on a number of levels. Businesses, it's not the same, but you have production tax credits, ITC credits that can support solar and wind industries, which we know are shedding something like over 600,000 jobs already. And then this was, renewable energy was supposed to be the job creator for the next decade. So you're actually seeing, I think, when you're talking about stimulus, giving money to fossil fuel companies and renewable and not to renewable energy companies, that's an issue, long-term and short-term, right? You're gutting job creation engines for the next decade and throwing a bunch of money to industries that we know are not going to deliver the economic growth, the jobs, any of the things that we need, right? So you can make those refundable like we did in ARA, right? And get a ton of money out of the door to support those deployments, support those industries, right? And then state and locals taking over things, particularly capital improvements that overlap with environmental justice, say like water pipes, water infrastructure that are huge, that right now states are mostly responsible largely on their own. Those are huge parts of their balance sheets that if the federal government just stepped in and said, hey, we're gonna take this off, not only could they close the funding gap, address environmental justice issues, but you're, you know, freeing up money for more services for states and locals in a time that's needed. And all of those things, right, help us address the climate crisis and environmental injustice. But I will say one thing, I heard someone, I think it was Mr. Sanberg, talking about solving problems, but I think this is a really good example of, for a long time, I think policy has been hamstrung, not just because of incrementalism, but because of the fact that a lot of our policies are set up not just to solve problems, but to also maintain a racial hierarchy, right? That actually prevents us from solving problems in the ways that they need to be solved. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there because I think we're facing both things. We need to both solve problems, but we also have to move from a method of solving problems that says a solution is not a solution if it doesn't keep white people comfortable.
Well, thank you for that, here. And I love the idea of a kind of a civilian conservation corps for climate, civilian climate corps kind of concept. I just saw Zephyr Teachout pop up here. She was running a little late and on the phone, and apparently is in the car. So this is a first that I know of Netroots in the car. So Zephyr is an associate professor at Fordham University, author of the recent Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. Makes a great companion to my book, Monopolized, by the way. I want to bring you in on this question, because we've been talking about improvements in climate, for example, and we've been talking about improvements in wages and taking on making sure corporations are paying their fair share in taxes, and all of this sort of hinges on this idea of whether we're going to maintain concentrated corporate power. And we know the next Congress and the next president is going to find themselves with a much more concentrated economy. What needs to be done to counteract this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having this panel. And I highly recommend David's book. But I'm honored to be on with so many incredible leaders that I look up to. I'm really glad that you started the discussion with talking about depression and the psychic impacts as well as the financial impacts. And I think it's really important to recognize the sort of psychic cruelty as well as the material cruelty of our current regime, and the added cruelty that we are repeatedly told that this is a fundamentally natural, inevitable system. These are the horrors of a pandemic as opposed to the results of deliberate choices. So what I want to talk about is breaking up corporate power, but I want to put it in a broader frame, which is I think it's going to be really important to understand our economy not as an organic, natural fact with some things that need trimming, but as a machine that has a series of mechanisms that are designed to suck value, power, and wages from poor and working class people to a handful of elites, and that these machines are not race neutral. So the machines are sucking value, and sucking value hugely disproportionately from people of color, and shifting that money and power to a network. It's not just individuals, it's a network of people who are the CEOs and in leadership positions and form a club. And then they use that power to enhance their own power. So my dream is that we then take that machine and basically turn it around so that we understand first that it's a machine, it's not natural, and we turn it around. And so what are those mechanisms? Well, some of those mechanisms are just, bad tax policy, radical under-enforcement of certain kinds of white-collar criminal laws. And I highly recommend people look back at this moment at the Prospects Day One agenda, which looked at areas where a new president can come in and really use executive authority to enforce in a way that would actually stop some of that sucking. But one of the primary tools for taking money from people and giving it to this club, and this overwhelmingly white club, is concentrated power, monopoly power. There's an old idea from the Sherman Act, which in fact, our initial federal antitrust law, which in fact criminalizes monopoly. Monopoly is a crime. It's not a sort of just technical violation. And the key idea here that's really important is that monopoly is a form of theft. It's stealing. And this is because middlemen standing in a choke point position can force both consumers and, increasingly importantly, and I think we really have to focus on this, workers, whether they be Uber drivers or Amazon sellers or Amazon warehouse workers, basically force them to say, if you want to have access to the economy, you're going to have to pay a major tax and pay to work here with insecure workplace, failure to provide basic protective equipment, and so forth. So monopoly power allows these corporations to then suck that money out. And I think the clearest example in the past 3 weeks, although we can show you examples around every industry, is the way in which sellers, we now know, pay about 30% of every dollar that people spend on Amazon goes to Amazon, not to the sellers. That's just highway robbery. That's just Amazon standing in this choke point position saying, if you want access to this essential part of our economy, you're going to have to pay a 30% tax that is going to go to Jeff Bezos, not to communities that desperately need help. But again, Amazon is also a major employer, and it's also saying if you want a precious job, and jobs are hard to come by right now, you are going to have to accept the largesse of our $15 an hour minimum wage, but not decent protection at work. And you are going to have to accept that we're going to be anti-labor and busting up unions. So it's really important to see monopoly as a form of theft, not as a technical violation, but as a way of taking money from people who are creating value. So what flows from this? One is that if we're going to break that machine, we both have to stop the merger machine that allows for this theft on massive scale, and then do more than that, not just stop that machine, but actually turn it around and fund things like the Green New Deal, take the best lessons from the earlier New Deal, and we shouldn't hold it up as a perfect model, but there's some really important lessons. Fund things like rural electricity co-ops, funnel money back into communities and not into the handful of enclaves of the super wealthy. The good news is, there's a lot of bad news, but there's a lot of evidence now that the public is understanding this, understanding that we actually have to do something. We just came out with polling. I worked with Data for Progress on some polling. And maybe you think people don't care about anti-monopoly. Well, it turns out a majority of Americans want a president who is going to take on breaking up big tech, big ag, and big cable. A majority of Americans want a major merger ban right now, because they're not stupid. They see the way in which that bazooka, as you've called it, David, to the super wealthy is feeding inequality. And at the same time, we're seeing as much as half of Black businesses collapse, and truly the total collapse of small businesses across the country and the incredible impact on communities. So I think the political, on the ground political movement is there, but our response needs to be much more than like stop a few violations. It needs to be systemic and turn around the power structures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is so important. I've been reporting all week actually on on Vice President Biden's agriculture policy, and been talking to farmers, and that's the main thing that comes out is we need to, this is strangling rural America. These big monopolies are strangling rural America, and we need to do something about it. So look for that in the prospect next week. And as long as you're mentioning it, here it is. This is in your swag bag, I think. Anyway, so Joe, I will get back to sort of corporate power and things like that, but you know, something that worked, I think, really well in the CARES Act was the $600 per week boost to unemployment checks. Performed very well. The problem is that it ran out, right? That it was time limited, but it created a lot of additional savings for people. It restored and kept propped up the economy more broadly. And it gave credence to this idea that if you just give people money, that is an excellent way to prevent poverty. So does this speak to the need for more discussion of basic income as really the ultimate kind of anti-poverty measure?
I think it speaks to the need for an above all of the above approach. I don't think that any single approach, including universal basic income, should be characterized as the ultimate solution. But I think, universal basic income is a legitimate part of a broader toolkit. And I think the unemployment insurance's effectiveness spoke to that. I also think, though, that this idea that there won't be jobs in the future is not aligned with human nature. It reminds me a little bit of the executive from the US Patent Office in the 1890s, who said in the 1890s that he was going to disband the patent office because he thought that everything that would ever be invented had been invented. And I think we may look back in 50 or even 20 or whatever years on this idea of a jobless future and laugh in a similar way. It's not to say that jobs won't change. The nature of work will definitely change. But the history of humankind shows that our brains have a pretty unlimited a way of conceiving of new ways to serve each other. And the reason I think a $25 minimum wage is so critical is not because I don't think that UBI has an important role in the toolkit. It does. But because I think work will always be part of humankind. We're always going to find new ways to ask each other to serve each other in exchange for some compensation. And a living wage that's a minimum wage is about fixing the social contract that says you can't exploit people. Because a minimum wage at $7.25 is exploitation. And so the moral urgency and economic necessity of a $25 minimum wage that could coexist with the UBI and coexist with a stronger earned income tax credit that applies to a broader definition of work is saying that in our society, for all the times that you're going to come up with a service you want to provide to another in exchange for compensation, there are basic levels of human dignity that you owe the other person. And that's what a minimum wage as a living wage means. If I may, I wanted to just briefly opine on one of Zephyr's points as she's describing the concentration of economic power. And it struck me that what she's describing is essentially economic authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. And maybe we can help people understand that the monopoly evil, if people understand that it's a threat to democracy. I think there's two fundamental threats we face to democracy. One is the threat to our right to vote, which has been going on for a long time and concentrated in a worse way now. But the other threat is the threat to our rights to be economically democratic. And just as we see authoritarian tendencies in President Trump, what monopoly essentially is authoritarianism in an economic setting that robs us of our freedom to choose where we work, that robs us of our freedom to choose where we consume. And I think that we need to look at the authoritarian threat we face, as a broad umbrella that includes, on one hand, Donald Trump, and on the other hand, monopolies.
Great. Yeah, I mean, when we meet a child, we say, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" We don't say, "What money do you want to collect?" Right? All right. I want to go back to Ro because I know he has to go very shortly, and then I'm going to go to Rhiana and Holly. Ro, we have this huge public health crisis right now, and people are still paying thousands of dollars for testing after several instances of Congress passing free testing. Millions have lost health insurance when they lost their jobs. It seems easier to make the sale in the context of the pandemic that tethering healthcare to employment has failed. And I'm wondering if, you're obviously a strong supporter of Medicare for All. I'm wondering if within the caucus and within the political system more generally, there's sort of a light bulb that has gone on because of what the pandemic has shown.
David, that's a excellent point. I just want to reference both your book and actually I was just reading Zephyr, so I've got it right here with me. So I highly recommend both the books on monopoly and excellent insights. Look, I don't understand for the life of me why we're still debating Medicare for All. We've had millions of people are losing their jobs, and the claim is very simple. You should not have your healthcare tied to your job. Your dignity, your intrinsic worth as a human being should not be dependent on whether you have a job or not. And it doesn't take great moral philosophy to understand that a person should have the ability to be treated and have basic health care, regardless of what occupation they may or may not do. That's all Medicare for All is saying. It's saying give every person health care from the day they are born. And this was the aspiration of our party, has been since FDR, since he articulated in his second Bill of Rights, the basic rights that people need for a dignified life. The light bulb has gone off for most Americans. I mean, even in my district where you have huge income disparity, on the one hand, you have janitors and custodians and food workers. On the other hand, you have tech CEOs. It used to be that there was an understanding with working Americans about the need for healthcare. Now you actually have a lot of techies, a lot of folks, even in small businesses, people in the middle class, upper middle class, who may have been laid off or may have had a furlough or may have kids who aren't getting a job and suddenly have to navigate this healthcare system and will find it outrageous. So we have a system now that it's obvious to everyone we need healthcare for everyone, and yet it's not part of our Democratic Party platform. It was part of our party platform until 1980, and yet we don't have it in our current party platform. It's why I've said that I'm not going to vote for this current party platform. We've actually taken a step backwards. 2016 extended Medicare to everyone up to 55. Our current platform only goes to 60. And it's important to recognize, look, we litigated this. I was for Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden won. No one is saying that Joe Biden has to take this position, but shouldn't the Democratic Party, in the midst of the greatest healthcare crisis in the last 100 years, have as our aspiration that we're going to have Medicare cover everyone, extend to everyone? Shouldn't that be part of our principles of our party, even if our candidate has to have a different position because of where he's coming from or for political reasons? Shouldn't the aspiration of our party be what the aspiration has always been from FDR until the Reagan Revolution? This is, I know, what almost everyone who I talk to as a Democrat believes that we need it. And yet I don't think we've had the political will to get it done. One final point on this. People often say, oh, is Medicare for All going to create jobs or hurt jobs, hurt job creation? And I'd highly recommend Debts of Despair, a book by Deaton and Case, who actually say that the current healthcare system is what's costing us jobs. It's costing us jobs because companies, businesses aren't willing to hire people if they're lower income, lower wage, given the healthcare costs. I mean, would you hire someone at $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 if you have to pay $25,000 of healthcare costs? So they aren't being willing to hire those individuals. Those jobs are either being automated or they're being outsourced, and they are hurting job creation. If you had a situation where healthcare was covered, Medicare for All, these businesses would be able to hire a lot more people and pay them a good wage. So Medicare for All is morally correct. It's actually job creating. It would be pro-competitiveness because our businesses wouldn't have to compete with other companies with this extraordinary tax. And so I think all of the intellectual arguments are there, and we just have to continue to make the case.
All right, great. And you know, I did see today that you vowed not to vote for the platform. That obviously probably took a lot of courage. So you know, you're to be commended for that. So I want to go sort of around the room on this. So I'll start with Rhiana. You know, let's do sort of a little experiment. You're the you come into office. You are president. You come in on day one. You can be the vice president if you want. You be whoever.
Wait a minute, as an elected official,
why would I go
as an elected official, I don't like that laughter. Don't laugh. Don't laugh.
It's more that like y'all
here we
have
go.
really hard jobs that only certain people are cut out for.
Exactly. Here we go. So obviously there's going to be this very depressed, uncertain landscape economically. And, you know, for some reason, the media, since FDR, has characterized this as a first 100 days issue. You have to do something in the first 100 days to tackle the economic challenges that we face. How do you prioritize that? What is the first thing that we need to do? What do the solutions look like early on to deal with the economic situation as you'll see it?
Well, I think the first thing to do is absolutely extend and expand support for families, in particular, small businesses in states and locals. So the first things that I'm doing are likely, well, you can't institute a basic income. I was like, nope, not through executive order. So,
well, look,
I mean,
Trump,
I think
Trump just had increased unemployment by himself. Really, there's no real rules anymore, if you think about it.
I mean, that, yes. But, you know, in the interest of still believing that things should be legal, I mean, the first thing that I think that you do is push for expanded unemployment benefits, a return to those, definitely a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures. Idea is to just like actually use anything available right now to build as strong of a safety net as you can, because once people enter poverty, poverty is cyclical. And so you want to keep people from having to fall so far, particularly because all of our safety net programs, particularly the ones that are federal, they require you to fall so far before you will get aid. They mean that you have to be out of all your assets. You have to be literally on your last leg. And we don't want people to have to get there before they can get help. The second thing I would say is like immediately funding for states and locals, because the thing that people get really fussed about the federal deficit and debt, but the fact is, like, if you're talking about financial freedom and the ability to do things, the federal government has far more leeway than states and locals. So when you're talking about states and locals, you're really talking about if you don't put more revenue in there, things are getting cut, like Holly spoke about. We're now going to have to talk about, if we don't get $14 billion, we're talking about cutting health and human services. We're talking about cutting higher education. Right. So a real understanding that, like, if we we are not just a federal government, we are, you know, a confederation of states, and we have to support those unless we want to have a very, very bad national picture. So I would focus on those things. And then I'm vague about small businesses, because honestly, the way that you would need to structure that has to be very thoughtful about race, because the ways that owners that are of color and marginalized, the ways that they access credit, where they get their money, the things that they would need to be able to access small business funds need some thought. People know how to do that, and I'm not that expert, but obviously that needs to be the next thing. And then I think that this is more of an ideological thing, but I think one thing that I would do is perhaps start a conversation about the fact that I think often we get very attached to the jobs we have right now. And we imagine that if we don't recreate this version of a job, there will be no more jobs. But jobs are not like truffles in the forest. You don't forage them out. As long as you pay somebody for something, it's a job, right? So we have like all of these fears. If this job leaves, what will the next job be? But really just letting people know that, like, truly, the idea is there's going to be a lot of work and a lot of new work that we're going to have to do. But rest assured that, like, the government will need to find out a way to not open up the types of jobs we have, but to just start to talk to Americans, I think, a little bit differently about jobs and about the fact that there is an ability to have a prosperous economic future, even if it doesn't look like this one, even if it looks very different from the economy that you grew up in, that it is still possible to pay people enough, even if all of a sudden the jobs that we're really investing in are care jobs, which are very far from our sort of macho, you know, we want everyone in a factory here or whatnot. but truly, what does it look like to be a care economy or whatnot? So just, I think those shifts, even though those are things over the long term, starting to have those conversations, I think is important in the short term.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's so important about the care economy. It's the fastest growing profession in the United States right now. We're actually gearing up to do an entire issue about the care economy. So
it's huge, and they're green jobs. They're low carbon jobs. If you're talking about greening an economy, it's a great thing to focus on.
Absolutely. Holly, I'm going to put you in the same position. The first 100 days, what needs to be done right away to help our people?
So I'm going to shift your question, if I may, to say the first 100 days of local life. Sure. And, you know, from my perspective, particularly in LA County, it's got to be addressing housing. You know, the last point in time count suggested that there were 70,000 unhoused in LA County. I think that's a huge undercount because we're not counting, you know, couch surfing. And if that point in time count was taken on the 20th, we didn't count the number of people who became unhoused on the 1st. And recognizing that the eviction moratoriums will come to an end. But another issue that continues to bubble up in my district are the mom and pop homeowners, the duplex, triplex owners, those, you know, the middle class African Americans who bought apartment buildings in an area of my district called the Jungle. In the 60s and 70s, they were my parents' peers as a part of their retirement plan. These are, you know, 12-unit buildings or smaller. And if no one is able, because of COVID, to pay their rent, we're going to squeeze that mom and pop property owner as well. And so that's my deep, deep concern as we are, you know, talking about gentrification and how we keep speculators out of neighborhoods. This is going to create an opportunity for them to come in waves. And so really figuring out how we keep people who are housed on the margin housed, and what we do to make sure that we quickly, efficiently, and in a humane and appropriate way house our unhoused, because congregate care settings are no longer safe and appropriate. Right. The federal government is going to have to come up and support us in terms of unemployment insurance. We're suffering. The weight of the number of people unemployed right now in California is crushing our EDD. And as budget chair, we are working overtime to stand up a system to even get the money out the door. And so that's the challenge happening at the state level. But if those dollars don't continue to come, you know, we're already in debt. I've lost track of the number in terms of our loans from the federal government to continue to make unemployment and the pandemic unemployment assistance available to California residents. So that has got to continue, got to flow, and states are going to have to make sure we have the infrastructure to get the money out the door quickly and efficiently. My district office staff are fielding calls every day from people who still haven't received money going back to March and April. And so we have a real tough situation here in California that we're trying to manage. I think from my perspective that would take all 100 is really figuring out our housing challenge in California and in LA County in particular. It's only going to get worse. That is what wakes me up in the middle of the night, figuring out what infrastructure we put in place to support those who are already unhoused and those who are on the margin with every passing day as this pandemic continues, because we still haven't gotten our arms completely around, you know, the first wave, knowing the second wave will come in short order.
Okay. I should mention that Khanna had to go. So I'm at this point going to go to Zephyr. You talked about the day one agenda. That's something that we put out last fall. It's executive actions that do not need Congress, do not need Mitch McConnell's sign off. There are a number of them. We actually went through the Biden-Sanders unity document, and we found 277 different actions within that document that could be taken by executive authority. not without anyone having to do any kind of congressional work. But you know, where should we focus our energies? What needs to be done in that first 100 days?
Yeah. Wow. So I think some of these things have been mentioned, but there's one component of just like basic human care, making sure people have enough money to live, have a place to live, and have health care. And we aren't even talking about that as what is basic, but that should be basic. And that's it. These are conservative ideas. The second is, you know, to get out of a moment like this, we do need big, exciting, dramatic, inspiring, and most importantly, everywhere in the country, jobs programs. Green New Deal. One of the things I love about the Green New Deal is it's structured as a major national program with a decentralized model. So we're providing the funding, we're providing the vision, but the money and the funding and who has power in it is at a much more local level. So I think the Green New Deal it's like its time has come for so many different reasons. You know, poison is increasingly unpopular, and the incredible need for green jobs is like the excitement around that is incredible. So one is like, I think of it as like care, and then moving forward. Those are two components, like really at a basic level. And then there's new rules of the road, you know, changing the way, talking about minimum wage, which is absolutely essential. We can never let our minimum wage become our maximum wage, which is one of the reasons we have to make sure that we allow for jobs where people aren't just scraping by. But this minimum wage right now is just abject cruelty and unacceptable. But then finally, I mean, we are not going to get out of this moment without taking on the thieves who got us here. Like we just can't pretend that this, like, we're all in this together. There are a handful of people who are not in this together with us. They have taken advantage of this pandemic to become wealthier and exercise more power than ever. And you know, you can write all the op-eds you want in the New York Times as a CEO of Uber, but we've seen what you've done. So I think of it as like care, hope, rules of the road, and then like take this anger and take on the thieves. And we need to do that because this is something David has been such a great leader on, is that we can't keep looking at policy just as like, if we like this part of the policy, then it's okay if there's other parts we don't like. We are at a constitutional moment right now. The CARES Act was a constitutional act, and it was a bad constitution. It gave people a few months of support, small businesses a few months of support, and private, Wall Street and big monopolies enormous amount of power. And so we have to understand that we're in an ongoing constitutional moment, and we can't just do what we want without ignoring who got us here and taking them on in an explicit way. So you've talked about it from the position of, there's different orientations. I think about it from the position of an activist. What can we do? And I think we should not be thinking just about the first 100 days for Biden-Harris, but the first 100 days for activists. What are our first 100 days look like? And our first 100 days, I think, need to take on all of those components. And we can talk about the details, but I hope we're in a moment where we're no longer going to get intimidated by economists who say, well, if you don't have an economics degree, you have no business telling us that power is messed up in our society. So I think our first 100 days as activists should have those 4 planks in it.
That's great. And it brings me to where I wanted to bring the discussion. There was such excitement when you talked about the Green New Deal and green jobs from Rhiana. I just can't help but, I can't pass over that. So, I mean, this is an important kind of inside-outside kind of conversation. Biden has outlined a plan to address climate change that, in many ways is more far-reaching than we've seen in previous administrations, but in other ways falls short. How can we ensure not only that Biden walks the walk on the promises that he's given, but also sees the opportunity in a Green New Deal in the fashion that it can be used as a great job creator and a great economic restorer. So Rhianna, if you want to take that. Sorry.
Zephyr probably has a great answer for that. Sorry, yeah, I was dancing a little bit because I just, I love being right. So, and for, and for a long time, people were like, the Green New Deal is ridiculous. And a lot of people say that still now. So what we need to do, well, the first thing is just pressure. Like the way to make, the reason that Biden's plan right now is what it is was pressure from activists, right? It was Sunrise doing sit-ins. It was people finally giving environmental justice activists, right, the time of day and including them in coverage and talking about why there cannot be any climate action without climate justice, right? So the things that we have seen, the fact that there is a carbon-free electricity goal by 2035, that is pressure. That is the result of pressure. And I think that, and it's also, I think the result of some like really savvy organizers that one knew that climate was an issue that I think particularly one party, right, can really jump on and throw down on because the other party is nowhere on it, right? So I think some people saw that. And I think the other thing that they saw was like, we will create the agenda, the box in which you have to move. And if you move outside of this box, it's going to be a problem. So I think it's just keeping those coalitions together, right? And continuing to keep a stake in the ground and continually actually refining that with more input from frontline communities about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable and going out on that foot. And I say that because I think the way that you keep sort of a Biden administration or any presidential administration honest is to continually tell them what it is, how a problem should be approached, right? Not necessarily all of the solutions, but this is what we want. And so I think that that's important, and that continuing to articulate a finer and finer version of that is also important. So I think it's also important for activists, because the Biden campaign is, or not the campaign, but a Biden administration, any presidential administration is not, if you just give them a framework, what you get on the other side of that framework can look nothing like that framework. Right? And so if all of the pressure is just about a framework, then you're leaving the space for the policy to be defined by people who are not in your frame. And so I think it's important for activists to continually sort of, and also work with policy folks to refine those visions so that we are constantly in the conversation and not getting pushed out as not the adults in the room, right? Let them do it and then bring in someone else to write it. So I think that's just really key. And for him to continue to move forward is, again, continually articulating a vision before someone else gets to articulate it for you.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and not just on climate policy, but on economic policy generally, on ag policy, on just a host of measures. Joe, I want to ask you, because we talk about sort of the activist constitution or the activist perspective and taking on or holding the feet to the fire of elected leaders, but that also needs to be true sort of in the corporate economy more generally. I mean, ultimately building a progressive economy starts with building worker power, right? And how can we approach this at this moment when the pandemic has atomized workers and built this large army of unemployed Americans that saps away at the bargaining power and the worker power that we have? So what are your thoughts about strategies to deal with that?
Well, I think we have to take matters into our own hands as consumers and be true allies to workers. We, as consumers, spend $36 billion every day in the economy. And only the tiniest fraction of us use those spending dollars in alignment with our values. And so a big, I think unfulfilled potential of our movement is to be more conscientious as consumers about where we spend our money, where we hold our money overnight in the bank, where we receive our payroll direct deposit, that we be progressive, not just how we vote, but in how we consume. Because ultimately, companies are going to respond to organizing power. And workers need some backup in the form of organized consumers who are showing businesses that if they do the wrong thing by their workers, that consumers are going to pull their money away from their goods and services. And I think this is one of the areas of our movement that requires a lot more attention in the next 4 years and beyond, is how do we broaden it out beyond elections, which are obviously critically important, but acknowledge the fact that every single day, as progressives, there are tens of millions of us who are spending money multiple times a day. Well, if we harness those spending choices in alignment with our values and toward businesses that did the right thing by their workers instead of stymied worker power, we would see so much change so fast in the way that workers are treated by businesses.
Okay. I actually want to ask Zephyr about that, because there's some parts of her book that talk about the limitations of boycotts and that kind of behavior. So Zephyr, could you just talk about that? It's interesting. This will get something going. You're on mute, Zephyr.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, this is an area of like that I think we need to talk about more, because I actually really disagree. I think that when you have a monopolized economy, ethical consumerism basically doesn't work. And like just the easy example is something like the trying to take on Amazon. If you hear about bad workplace or bad workplace abuses in Amazon, individual progressives withdrawing from that is not going to change those processes. This is still the dominant online retail. And there is some evidence, but we actually don't talk about in the book, but that people who use vote with their feet, buy things in an ethical way, are actually less likely to contact elected officials. So I'm not opposed to progressives doing that, but what I am opposed to is a few different things. One is I think the sequence should be different. When you hear about bad workplace activity, the first thing you should do is call Chuck Schumer if you're in New York. And then the second thing is maybe think about, so first political action, then consumer action. And there are incredible examples of great, very effective consumer boycotts, but there aren't as many as you think. And the recent history is littered with examples of failed, either half-hearted or eventually petering out consumer boycotts. And ultimately, I think the consumer boycott model makes us sort of buy into the idea that these corporations are our legitimate governors. Like Zuckerberg, we're going to boycott you until you're nicer, instead of like, no, if I have a problem with Zuckerberg, I want to go to the antitrust subcommittee and say, change your business model. And so I think it's not, theoretically, it's not necessarily like in a decentralized economy, if there's 10 cereal companies, truly 10 cereal companies, and one is tearing down a rainforest, and you organize a boycott of that, I can actually see how that changes that one company's behavior. But when there's 2 cereal companies, they can outlast you. And so I don't want to be naive about this structure of power right now and exactly how concentrated things can be. Now, having said that, I was a real skeptic of the Stop Hate for Profit Facebook boycott, because I didn't think it was going to change Facebook's business model. And I don't think it changed Facebook's business model. I don't think it, Facebook is still actively promoting divisive white nationalists. But I do think it was a very effective strategic boycott, because it helped beat up in a very public, important, essential way a company that really needed a lot of beating up. So I think there can be these strategic efforts, but too often when it's decentralized, it actually gets in the way of political action. And I want more political action and more thinking about how we can act as citizens before we act as consumers.
Joe, I'm happy to have you respond to that.
Sure. Well, I don't disagree at all. What I'd like to do is clarify as opposed to dispute, because I think Zephyr is right on the mark. And by no means do I think that, you know, a handful or even a lot of individuals boycotting a monopoly is going to have much of an effect. So to reposition my perspective on this, I'm saying that in addition to the urgency of political action, as progressives, we also need to treat and change the constituents in the economy, such as we need to build progressive companies. I think there's two ways that you change the behavior of companies. You regulate them and you compete against them. And the crisis is so urgent that I don't think have the luxury of picking just one tool over the other. And a big thing that as progressives we really haven't done much of is let's build progressive alternatives that are competitive against these monopolies. So imagine if there was a progressive alternative to Facebook. And we can parallel track the need to regulate Facebook and other monopolies, and entrepreneurs can be called on to go and build better versions of companies that are delivering services that people want, creating competition. And I think what we're suffering from now is the perfect storm combination of two failures. One, the failure of our government to regulate monopolies, and two, the missed opportunity of us as progressives to engage as entrepreneurs in the economy to build companies that do things in progressive ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard to get to number two before dealing with number one.
I think we can do them in parallel, David, and I don't think that we have the luxury of just sequencing. I mean, frankly, in not parallel tracking them, we miss also an opportunity to engage millions of people who have progressive hearts, but maybe aren't inclined to working in politics. And I think this, again, is a missed frontier for our movement. There are so many small business people and entrepreneurs who maybe aren't going to engage as activists, but can be allies of the movement in building companies that do things the right way.
Okay, we could have this discussion forever, I think, but we'll just move on. We have about a little less than 15 minutes left in this panel. Holly, one of the big issues that gets dealt with at the local level is education. One of the things that was one of the more appalling, I think, moments of the Trump pandemic economic conversation was this concept by Ivanka that we can just find something new. This idea that education would bridge this entire gap, and that there's if people just accumulate certain skills, that's all that we're going to need. Ultimately, this is a very unsatisfying response. What policies do you think in education are needed, however, to support a stronger economy?
Great question. In California, we began the transition a couple of years ago, where there was a point in time when the goal was for everyone to have the A through, I guess it's G pattern. In my day, it was the A through F pattern. So you would be UC eligible, and we defunded all of the, we defunded out of the high school level all the trades, and so we've had a shift. There are a number of high schools now that have brought the trades back in. I happen to represent LA Trade Tech College and the community college system in my Senate district. And I was shocked to learn a number of years ago when I went there, the number of students who already have BAs who couldn't find jobs. So they're now back at Trade Tech at the community college level to learn a trade. And so I think making sure that we are as diverse as possible in our funding to support those who want to go through our CSU UC system, holding those systems accountable, that they are still managing their curriculum to be relevant, quite frankly, to the workforce. I had someone who'd come up I sat on Rules Committee, who was being confirmed to the UC Board of Regents, and we were asking about the curriculum and is it relevant? Because when I step on a UC campus, the students say, what should I major in to get a job? My parents are on my back. And so those are the questions I was asking this person that was up for confirmation, who told me that higher education wasn't about getting a job, it was about self-fulfillment. And I said, oh, okay. In my neighborhood, it's about you get a degree to get a job. And that's the pressure young people are feeling in California with the rising cost of higher education, the rising cost of housing, and their parents panicking when you can't guarantee Tuition will remain the same when your child enters as a freshman to your senior year, their senior year. How do you plan? And so I think that, you know, the higher ed community, the community college level, four-year universities, you know, have to continue to be relevant, work in concert with business, work in concert with futurists to figure out how we prepare the next generation of California students to continue to lead, so California can continue to be the innovative state that it is. You know, as Joe talked about, there will always be work, there will always be jobs. Figuring out what they will be in time to prepare and educate our workforce is critical. And then for me, leveling the playing field. I am so deeply concerned, afraid, quite frankly, when I read LA Times cover stories about the number of Black and brown students in LAUSD, the second largest school district in the country, who never signed in throughout spring to the online app. Yeah. Where are those students? Did they have access to the internet? Did every child in the household have a tablet or something so they could participate in school? Those are all questions that we don't have the answers to. And so I think structurally, we have a lot of work to do on the front end to make sure that we are supporting our students right now at a critical time, a time that we don't know how long it's gonna last, if they're gonna be not in a physical classroom and learning from home someplace. Those are issues I think we have to confront now, or we will continue to be in quicksand trying to make sure that California and this country has a domestic workforce that is prepared, innovative, and prepared to lead.
Yeah,
I'm afraid.
That was a great story in the LA Times about the racial gaps in online learning, and there's a very strong ed tech private sector that is looking to fundamentally transform K through 12 education right now, and it's incredibly dangerous. We actually did a story about that prospect earlier this week. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience right now. If you have them, feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat or wherever. But this was an interesting one based on the discussion that Joe and Zephyr were having from Jess Wackler, saying, I think some companies need more than regulation and competition. They need to be owned by the government. And of course, you know, public options and public alternatives, whether it's community broadband or public banking, can be a very good tool, not just in the space of anti-monopoly, but also in building more competition, more prosperity, and a more robust economy. Does anyone want to take that about the concept of public, whether it's public jobs or public companies, public alternatives?
I'll just jump in briefly to say I agree. Yes, you know, the one thing that should be illegitimate is concentrated private power. But there's a lot of different ways to deal with that. You can deal with that by, say, breaking up a company by function. You know, like Glass-Steagall for all kinds of industries. John Deere, you can't own a financing arm because you have just too much power over farmers. Or you can do it by regulating like a public utility, sort of having heavy regulations. And just don't be naive that like public utility regulation has its own pitfalls. Like it's not always easy, but I think that that's doing it well and trying to do it well is really important. Saying it has to basically take all comers equally, or you can do it by nationalizing. Those are all legitimate forms of markets. And what we're really talking about is like what makes a moral economy, what exists in a moral market. And then we know we have these like gross immoral aspects of it, but I don't think nationalizing should be off the table, and I don't think we should be scared of that. The question is, when do you want to nationalize? When do you want to break up? And when do you want to have it state run, but at the hyper local level or at the state level? And, you know, obviously education, there's this push to versions of privatization across the board, or privatizing part of that. I think that's a huge problem. So I don't think we should be scared of that. We should just say there's one illegitimate form, and that is concentrated private power.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a chapter in my book about Chattanooga, Tennessee, which has the fastest broadband in the United States, if not the world, and it's entirely delivered through their public utility, fiber to the home, through a Tennessee Valley Authority electric power board. But the monopolists, the AT&T and Comcast, passed a law in Tennessee saying that you can't extend that beyond the service area. And so if you go 2 minutes outside of Chattanooga, people are using dial-up, and their kids are going to Starbucks parking lots to catch the Wi-Fi to do their homework every night. So that's the divide right there, and it's a divide between public ownership and private ownership. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge opportunity.
And I wonder if I just may add to it, and you all would be the ones to answer the question, but you know, if it always has to be all or nothing, sometimes politically we can't make that move. And so if there are partnerships, and not just partnerships because like government's broke, so we can't do it, the government has the land, and then you pay for the whatever.
I am your partner, right?
Exactly. But a real partnership in terms of envisioning and execution. And so I just wonder if it's not also viable to have that third option where the best of government and the best of the private sector can come together and support one another in a meaningful way.
I mean, I think it's certainly possible, right? But in this case, the Chattanooga broadband is a moneymaker for this, for not only for the actual electric company, but for the city. It's created a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship. There's 3D printing is this amazing feature in Chattanooga. You see these incubators. It is a massive tech sector in the Southwest, or Southeast, I should say, that doesn't have really any ties to Silicon Valley or anything, but it's because they have this public broadband setup that improves health, improves education, improves telehealth, and all of these things. So anyway, that's enough of my pitch for the Chattanooga Tourist Board. I want to go to this next question. And we touched on this a little bit about taxes, but you know, we've seen, this is an anonymous attendee saying, we've seen this Congress use taxes to benefit corporations at the expense of the American people. It seems like rewriting the rules of taxes could be a vehicle that progressives use for equity. So not just to raise money to get them, you know, to get that money funneled into programs that we like, but actually as an equity building tool. Does Rhiana or Joe, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely the case. Obviously, taxes play a role in raising revenue, and that's what we tend to focus on. But they have a big role in equity, and they have had an impact on the fact that we have so much income and wealth inequality today. Part of that is because of the tax code, right? We tax income much more than we tax capital gains, right? Which is how most rich people get their money. They're not out here, you know, working paycheck to paycheck the way that most of us are. They're getting their money from investments. And all of that is taxed at, honestly, rates that are criminally low at this. It doesn't make any sense, both for a functioning government, right, that needs revenue for programs, or as the basis for prosperous and equitable economy. So absolutely. And I think there's also, it's also the case right now that the level of inequality that we have now, we cannot deal with through post-tax transfers, which is generally how we've been doing it, right? The EITC, we don't do anything in the labor market, but then we try to fix it through taxes. And I think it's Saez, but they're in a paper that he put out a couple years ago. But we know right now that the level of inequality that we have, we cannot fix anymore post taxes. We're talking about through the tax system and before the tax is levied, right, in the labor market in terms of worker power and wages. And that's just where we are right now. And so taxes play a huge role in equity, and also in terms of, it's very difficult to have an equitable society if you don't have a social safety net. You can't have a social safety net if you don't have adequate revenue, right? So it's also thinking about the impact that it has on a system and our ability to build an equitable system and an equitable sort of economy. That's really important.
Great. Excellent. We have more questions. I wish we had more time, but we don't. We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, Holly Mitchell, Joe Sanberg, Zephyr Teachout, Representative Khanna, and thank you for being here, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks.